welcome to this fortnight's episode of the House Detective Diaries. So this week I'm going to do something a little bit different, and although I normally research houses in Brisbane, this week I'm going to take you through some of the houses that I've researched throughout Queensland, because I do research houses all over Australia. And then next fortnight's video I'll take you through some of the amazing houses that I've researched interstate. So let's get started. We are going to start with a house in Toowoomba. Now, this house is built on land that was subdivided and sold as the depot paddock estate because it had been, surprisingly enough, a depot paddock. Now, that's not the most glamorous name for a housing estate. However, the houses that were eventually built there were absolutely beautiful. Now, the first time that a resident appears in the location of the subject house is in about 1903. However, I wasn't really able to narrow down the date of construction much further than that. And that's one problem you do have with houses outside capital cities. It can be much harder to find information on them, and so therefore much harder to narrow down things specifically. So this house was built between about 1898 and 1903. The first resident was Charles Anstey, who was a music teacher. He occupied the house from about 1903 until about 1912. Ernest and Annie Jubb then purchased the house, and they christened it Vincenza, which was the middle name of their daughter, and it was also the feminine version of Ernest's middle name, Vincent. So they owned the house for many, many years and lived there for a long time. And it was actually one of their descendants that got in touch to hire me to research this house, because she actually had the brass nameplate with the name Vincenza on it. And she knew it had come from a family house in Toowoomba, but she wasn't exactly sure what had happened to the house. So she wanted me to try and see if we could find out whether it had been demolished or relocated. The Jubb family lived there for ages, and Ernest and Annie's daughter Ventnor, which is a really unusual name, apparently it was a family name that she absolutely hated. So Ventnor Vincenza Jubb was her full name. She was often featured in the social pages and was a well-known identity in the Toowoomba area. The great thing was that the descendant that hired me had not only photos of the family, but also some photos of the house. So what did I find out? Well, I wasn't able to confirm whether it was demolished or removed, but it disappeared from the site in Toowoomba between 1988 and 1992. So if anyone out there knows what happened to Vincenza, I would absolutely love to hear from you, as would the descendant of the Jubb family. Number 4 is a house at Glen Aplin, which is right down near the Queensland-New South Wales border, close to Stanthorpe. Researching this house really highlights some of the issues you have when trying to find out more information about houses that are outside capital cities. Now, 3 of the resources that I mainly use to research the history of houses, particularly the date of construction, is electoral rolls, post office directories, and old newspapers on Trove. So the issue you get when you're researching houses in a rural town is that often the residents aren't listed with a street address. So on the electoral roll, they'll just be listed as, in this case, James Smith. Honestly, could you have a more difficult common name to research? But anyway, James Smith. So he's listed as living in Glen Aplin. However, because the street name's not given any of the electoral roll records, newspaper records, or post office directories, I can't establish exactly when he first lived on his block of land. That means that it's very hard to narrow down the date of construction for the house. And when I'm using newspapers, it's usually birth, death, and marriage records or advertisements that are placed in newspapers that will help place a person that owned the property at a particular time, which generally shows you that there was a house there by that date. So very tricky in this instance to narrow down when it was built, but I was able to find out a little bit more information about the family members and that type of thing and what they got up to on that land. They were actually orchardists. So although I can find out some information, as I mentioned, it can be very tricky to find out details in rural properties, but you never know what you're going to uncover until you start researching it. And I'm always very upfront with people who hire me to research rural properties and tell them that, look, I may not be able to find much. And that was the case with this example, but they were happy for me to proceed. Number 3, Cordalba, which is up near Bundaberg in Queensland. The other interesting thing with researching rural properties is that I often come across unusual certificates of title for the land. Now, certificates of title are, as any of you that own a house would probably know, is the title issued to you when you purchase a house to show that you're the freeholder, the outright owner of that block. However, in rural properties, a lot of land was issued under lease from the government. Now, this house at Cordalba was an example of that, where it was leased to Percival Harrison under what was called a conditional lease. So I looked into this a bit further, and basically what it meant was that he had applied for the lease. He'd been granted it under the condition that he made certain improvements on the property. So he would pay a weekly rent, and in the meantime, while he was paying that rent, he had to make improvements. And by improvements, I mean building a residence, clearing the land, building fencing, building drainage, that type of thing. Anything that made the land better able to be used for agricultural or grazing, which was the government's ultimate aim, to open up new areas, get it cleared and get the land making money. So Percival made sufficient improvements on the property to finally be issued with a deed of grant, meaning he owned the land outright in 1897. Number 2. In my last episode, I had a good old rant about relocated houses and why it's much better to leave them with where they are, and how hard it is to research houses that have been relocated. But this house was a new one for me because it had been relocated not once, but twice in its history. The current owners who purchased it, and it's now located up at Peachester, well outside of Brisbane, they were told that it was initially moved from Kangaroo Point to make way for the construction of the Story Bridge. It was moved to a site at Anley, and I definitely know that it was there. I was able to find old images of it on that block at Anley. And it was then subsequently moved again up to Peachester. So yeah, certainly got around, this old girl. And when I started to look into it, I definitely discovered that a lot of houses were removed rather than demolished for making way for the Story Bridge. And that was a complete rabbit hole because, firstly, it not only took me to these amazing photos of the Story Bridge under construction, but it also took me to a number of newspaper articles where they were selling off the houses that were to be relocated. So my job was then to try and find, in the background detail of early photos before the bridge was constructed, was to try and find a house that looked like this one. The problem was that it was quite a common style of house. I also was looking through the newspaper articles trying to find one that matched the location. Unfortunately, despite going cross-eyed, scouring hundreds of different images from different angles and different perspectives of Kangaroo Point, I wasn't able to find any house that looked like this one exactly. So that was a bit disappointing. So I couldn't actually prove that this house had come from Kangaroo Point, but it's certainly feasible that a house relocated for the construction of the Story Bridge could have been moved out to Anley. The other thing was that the house had been moved to the block at Anley because it didn't appear in earlier aerial photos predating the Story Bridge, if that makes sense. So it's quite feasible that it was shifted there in around that time the bridge was being constructed. Then the removal company that took it from the Anley block up to Peachester had given the current owners that information, so we knew that was okay. So I could research its history on the block in Anley, but that was about all that I could find out. Refer to my previous rant about why you shouldn't relocate houses, because you lose that connection with the early history and you lose the connection with the early suburb as well, and then they end up completely out of context and they don't make sense in their new location. Having said that, it's been renovated beautifully. It's an absolutely amazing house, and it's far better that it's gone to another life up at Peachester than it being demolished in the first place or the second place. Number 1. This has to be one of the most beautiful homes I think I've ever researched. It is in Gympie and it's on Lady Mary Terrace. Now, this street was not named after the Downton Abbey character. It was named after, of all things, a gold reef in the area. This connection with the mining and the gold reef, which was located quite close to the house, is epitomised by 2 titles that were issued over the land in 1897. Now, this subdivided the land, and this was the first time I'd ever come across this. The first title was issued over the land to a depth of 50 feet, and the second title was issued over the ground below 50 feet, including any gold reserves that were discovered there. So a very interesting vertical subdivision. The land was bought by a doctor, Henry Morgan, and he and his wife Eleanor built the beautiful house that you can see in these photos. At the back of the house, Henry also built rooms where he could run his medical practice out of. And the next owner, John Cuppage, continued this tradition. He was a doctor and he also ran his medical practice out of the back of the house. And the current owner of the house actually still has the brass plate with Cuppage's name on it that would have hung outside the medical practice, which is a really cool remnant that shows the early history of the house. So that was my top 5 favourite houses that I've researched around Queensland. I hope you enjoyed hearing a little bit about the history and the stories from each of them, and I'll see you next time.